When Schneider offered him coffee cake, brown with sugar and cinnamon freshly rewarmed, he swaggeringly accepted it with his left hand without asking to be relieved of the cup. He continued to eat and drink between bites and sips, resting and steadying his forearms on the edge of the tank. The conclusion of the café cloche seemed a good time to broach the matter of the Decabs. Schneider admitted knowing McLeod and recalled, somewhat vaguely, it seemed, the incident in which he had restored to service McLeod's broomstick. "Hugh Donnell is a good boy," he said. "Machines I do not like, but it pleasures me to fix things for boys." "Grandfather," asked Waldo, "will you tell me how you fixed Hugh Donald McLeod's ship?" "Have you such a ship you wish me to fix?" "I have many such ships which I have agreed to fix, but I must tell you that I have been unable to do so. I have come to you to find out the right way." Schneider considered this. "That is difficult. I could show you, but it is not so much what you do as how you think about it. That makes only with practice." Waldo must have looked puzzled, for the old man looked at him and added, "It is said that there are two ways of looking at everything. That is true and less than true, for there are many ways. Some of them are good ways and some are bad. One of the ancients said that everything either is or is not. That is less than true, for a thing can both be and not be. With practice one can see it both ways. Sometimes a thing which is for this world is a thing which is not for the other world. Which is important, since we live in the other world." "We live in the other world? How else could we live?" "The mind, not the brain, but the mind is in the other world, and reaches this world through the body. That is one true way of looking at it, though there are others." "Is there more than one way of looking at Decab receptors?" "Certainly. If I had a set which is not working right brought in here, would you show me how to look at it?" "It is not needful," said Schneider, "and I do not like for machines to be in my house. I will draw you a picture." Waldo felt impelled to insist, but he squelched his feeling. "You have come here in humility," he told himself, "asking for instruction. Do not tell the teacher how to teach." Schneider produced a pencil and a piece of paper, on which he made a careful and very neat sketch of the antenna sheaf and main axis of a sky car. The sketch was reasonably accurate as well, although it lacked several essential minor details. "These fingers," Schneider said, "reach deep into the other world to draw their strength. In turn it passes down this pillar," he indicated the axis, "to where it is used to move the car." A fair allegorical explanation, thought Waldo. By considering the other world simply a term for the hypothetical ether, it could be considered correct if not complete. But it told him nothing. Hugh Donald, Schneider went on, was tired and fretting. He found one of the bad truths. "Do you mean," Waldo said slowly, "that McLeod's ship failed because he was worried about it?" "How else?" Waldo was not prepared to answer that one. It had become quite evident that the old man had some quaint superstitions. Nevertheless, he might still be able to show Waldo what to do, even though Schneider did not know why. "And what did you do to change it?" "I made no change. I looked for the other truth." "But how? We found some chalk marks. Those? They were but to aid me in concentrating my attention in the proper direction. I drew them so," he illustrated with pencil on the sketch, and thought how the fingers reached out for power, and so they did." "And that's all? Nothing more?" "That is enough." Either Waldo considered the old man did not know how he had accomplished the repair, or he had had nothing to do with it, in sheer and amazing coincidence. He had been resting this empty cup on the rim of his tank, the weight supported by the metal while his fingers merely steadied it. His preoccupation caused him to pay too little heed to it, and it slipped from his tired fingers, clattering and crashing to the floor. He was much chagrined. "Oh, I'm sorry, Grandfather. I'll send you another." "No matter, I will mend." Schneider carefully gathered up the pieces, placed them on the desk. "You have tired," he added. "That is not good. It makes you lose what you have gained. Go back now to your house, and when you have rested, you can practice reaching for the strength by yourself." It seemed a good idea to Waldo. He was growing very tired, and it was evident that he was to learn nothing specific from the pleasant old fraud. He promised emphatically and quite insincerely to practice, reaching for strength, and asked Schneider to do him the favor of summoning his bearers. The trip back was uneventful. Waldo did not even have the spirit to bicker with the pilot. Stalemate. Machines that did not work but should, and machines that did work but in an impossible manner, and no one to turn to but one foggy-headed old man. Waldo worked lackadaisically for several days, repeating, for the most part, investigations he had already made rather than admit to himself that he was stuck, that he did not know what to do, and that he was in fact wit and might as well call Gleason and admit it. The two bewitched sets of decobs continued to work whenever activated, with the same strange and incredible flexing of each antenna. Other decobs which had failed in operation and had been sent to him for investigation still refused to function. Still others which had not yet failed performed beautifully without the preposterous fidgeting. For the umpteenth time he took out the little sketch Schneider had made and examined it. There was, he thought, just one more possibility: to return again to Earth and insist that Schneider actually do, in his presence, whatever it was that he had done which caused the decobs to work. He knew now that he should have insisted on it in the first place, but he had been so utterly played out by having to fight that devilish thick field that he had not had the will to persist. Perhaps he could have Stevens do it and have the process stereophotoed for later examination. No, the old man had a superstitious prejudice against artificial images. He floated gently over to the vicinity of one of the inoperative decobs. What Schneider had claimed to have done was preposterously simple. He had drawn chalk marks down each antenna so that for the purpose of fixing his attention. Then he had gazed down them and thought about them, reaching out for power, reaching into the other world, stretching. Balder began to bark frantically. "Shut up, you fool!" Waldo snapped, without taking his eyes off the antenna. Each separate pencil of metal was wiggling, stretching. There was the low, smooth hum of perfect operation. Waldo was still thinking about it when the television demanded his attention. He had never been in any danger of cracking up mentally as Rambaud had done. Nevertheless, he had thought about the matter in a fashion which made his head ache. He was still considerably bemused when he cut in his end of the sound vision. Yes? It was Stevens. "Hello, Mr. Jones. We wondered, that is—" "Speak up, man. Well, how close are you to a solution?" Stevens blurted out. "Matters are getting pretty urgent." "In what way?" "There was a partial breakdown in Great New York last night. Fortunately, it was not at peak load, and the ground crew were able to install spares before the reserves were exhausted. But you can imagine what it would have been like during the rush hour. In my own department, the crashes have doubled in the past few weeks, and our underwriters have given notice. We need results pretty quick." "You'll get your results," Waldo said loftily. "I'm in the final stages of the research." He was actually not that confident, but Stevens irritated him even more than most of the smooth apes. Doubt and reassurance mingled in Stevens' face. "I don't suppose you could care to give us a hint of the general nature of the solution?" No, Waldo could not. Still, it would be fun to pull Stevens' leg. "Come close to the pickup, Dr. Stevens, I'll tell you." He leaned forward himself until they were almost nose to nose in effect. "Magic is loose in the world." He cut the circuit at once. Down in the underground labyrinth of North America's home plant, Stevens stared at the black screen. "What's the trouble, Chief?" McLeod inquired. "I don't know. I don't rightly know. But I think that Fatty has slipped his cams, just the way Rambaud did." McLeod grinned delightedly. "How sweet! I always did think he was a hoot owl." Stevens looked very sober. "You had better pray that he hasn't gone nuts. We're depending on him. Now let me see those operation reports." Magic loose in the world. It was as good an explanation as any, Waldo mused. Causation gone haywire. Sacrosanct physical laws no longer operative. Magic. As Gramps Schneider had put it, it seemed to depend on the way one looked at it. Apparently Schneider had known what he was talking about, although he had naturally had no real grasp of the physical theory involved in the decobs. Wait a minute. He had been going at the problem wrongly, perhaps. He had approached it with a certain point of view himself. A point of view which had made him critical of the old man's statements. an assumption that he, Waldo, knew more about the whole matter than Schneider did. To be sure, he had gone to see Schneider, but he had thought of him as a backcountry hex doctor, a man who might possess one piece of information useful to Waldo, but who was basically ignorant and superstitious. Suppose he were to review the situation from a different viewpoint. Let it be assumed that everything Schneider had to say was coldly factual and enlightened, rather than allegorical and superstitious. He settled himself to do a few hours of hard thinking. In the first place, Schneider had used the phrase, the other world, time and again. What did it mean, literally? A world was a space-time energy continuum. An other world was therefore such a continuum, but a different one from the one in which he found himself. Physical theory found nothing repugnant in such a notion. The possibility of infinite numbers of continua was a familiar, orthodox speculation. It was even convenient in certain operations to make such an assumption. Had Graham Schneider meant that? A literal physical other world? On reflection, Waldo was convinced that he must have meant just that, even though he had not used conventional scientific phraseology. Other world sounds poetic, but to say an additional continuum implies physical meaning. The term had led him astray. Schneider had said that the other world was all around, here, there, and everywhere. Well, was not that a fair description of a space superposed and in one-to-one correspondence? Such a space might be so close to this one that the interval between them was an infinitesimal, yet unnoticed and unreachable, just as two planes may be considered at coextensive and separated by an unimaginably short interval, yet to be perfectly discrete one from the other. The other space was not entirely unreachable. Schneider had spoken of reaching into it. The idea was fantastic, yet he must accept it for the purposes of this investigation. Schneider had stated that it was a matter of mental outlook. Was that really so fantastic? If a continuum were in an unmeasurably short distance away, yet completely beyond one's physical grasp, would it be strange to find that it was most easily reached through some subtle and probably subconscious operation of the brain? The whole matter was subtle, and heaven knew that no one had any real idea of how the brain worked. No idea at all. It was laughably insufficient to try to explain the writing of a symphony in terms of the mechanics of colloids. No, nobody knew how the brain worked. One more inexplicable ability in the brain was not too much to swallow. Come to think of it, the whole notion of consciousness and thought was fantastically improbable. All right, so McLeod disabled his skycar himself by thinking bad thoughts. Schneider fixed it by thinking the correct thoughts. Then what? He reached a preliminary conclusion almost at once. By extension, the other DeKalb failures were probably failures on the part of the operators. The operators were probably run down, tired out, worried about something, and in some fashion still not clear they infected or affected the DeKalbs with their own troubles. For convenience, let us say that the DeKalbs were short-circuited into the other world. Poor terminology, but it helped him to form a picture. Grimes' hypothesis: run down, tired out, worried about something. Not proved yet, but he felt sure of it. The epidemic of crashes, though material, was simply an aspect of the general myasthenia caused by shortwave radiation. And if that were true, he cut in a sight-sound circuit to Earth and demanded to talk with Stevens. Dr. Stevens, he began at once, there's a preliminary precautionary measure which should be undertaken right away. Yes? First, let me ask you this. Have you had many failures of DeKalbs in private ships? What is the ratio? I can't give you exact figures at the moment, Stevens answered, somewhat mystified, but there have been practically none. It's the commercial lines which have suffered. Just as I suspected, a private pilot won't fly unless he feels up to it, but a man with a job goes ahead no matter how he feels. Make arrangements for special physical and psycho-examinations for all commercial pilots flying DeKalb-type ships. Ground any who are not feeling in tip-top shape. Call Dr. Grimes, who'll tell you what to look for. That's a pretty tall order, Mr. Jones. After all, most of these pilots, practically all of them, aren't our employees. We don't have much control over them. That's your problem, Waldo shrugged. I'm trying to tell you how to reduce crashes in the interim before I submit my complete solution. But Waldo heard no more of the remark. He had cut off when he himself was through. He was already calling over a permanently energized, leased circuit which kept him in touch with his terrestrial business office, with his trained SEALs. He gave them some very odd instructions, orders for books, old books, rare books, books dealing with magic. Stevens consulted with Gleason before attempting to do anything about Waldo's difficult request. Gleason was dubious. He offered no reason for the advice. None. He told me to look up Dr. Grimes and get his advice as to what specifically to look for. Dr. Grimes? The MD who introduced me to Waldo, mutual friend? I recall. It'll be difficult to go about grounding men who don't work for us. Still, I suppose several of our larger customers would cooperate if we asked them to and gave them some sort of reason. What are you looking so odd about? Stevens told him of Waldo's last inexplicable statement. Do you suppose it could be affecting him the way it did Dr. Rambeau? Could be, I suppose, in which case it would not be well to follow his advice. Have you anything else to suggest? No, frankly. Then I see no alternative but to follow his advice. He's our last hope, a forlorn one, perhaps, but our only one. Stevens brightened a little. I could talk to Doc Grimes about it. He knows more about Waldo than anyone else. You would have to consult him anyways, don't you? Very well, do so. Grimes listened to the story without comment. When Stevens had concluded, he said, Waldo must be referring to the symptoms I have observed with respect to shortwave exposure. That's easy. You can have the proofs of the monograph I've been preparing. I'll tell you all about it. The information did not reassure Stevens. It helped to confirm his suspicion that Waldo had lost his grip. But he said nothing. Grimes continued, As for the other Jim, I can't visualize Waldo losing his mind that way. He never did seem very stable to me. I know what you mean, but his paranoid streak is no more like what Rambeau succumbed to than chickenpox is like mumps. Matter of fact, one psychosis protects against the other, but I'll go see. You will? Good. Can't go today. Got a broken leg and some children's colds that bear watching. Been some polio around. Ought to be able to make it to the end of the week, though. Doc, why don't you give up GP work? It must be deadly. Used to think so when I was younger, but about 40 years ago I quit treating diseases and started treating people. Since then I've enjoyed it. Waldo indulged in an orgy of reading, gulping the treatise on magic and related subjects as fast as he could. He had never been interested in such subjects before, and now, in reading about them with the point of view that there might be, and even probably was, something to be learned, he found them intensely interesting. There was frequent references to another world. Sometimes it was called the other world, sometimes the little world. Read with the conviction that the term referred to an actual material different continuum, he could see that many of the practitioners of the forbidden arts had held the same literal viewpoint. They gave directions for using this other world. Sometimes the directions were fanciful, sometimes they were baldly practical. It was fairly evident that at least 90% of all magic, probably more, was balderdash and sheer mystification. The mystification extended even to the practitioners, he felt. They lacked the scientific method. They employed a single-valued logic as faulty as the two-valued logic of the obsolete Spencer determinism. There was no suggestion of modern extensional, many-valued logic. Nevertheless, the laws of contiguity, of sympathy, and of homeopathy had a sort of twisted rightness to them, when considered in relation to the concept of another, different but accessible world. A man who had some access to a different space might well believe in a logic in which a thing could be, not be, or be anything with equal ease. Despite the nonsense and confusion which characterized the treatments of magic, which dated back to the period when the art was in common practice, the record of accomplishment of the art was impressive. There was curare and digitalis in quinine, hypnotism and telepathy. There was the hydraulic engineering of the Egyptian priests. Chemistry itself was derived from alchemy. For that matter, most modern science owed its origins to the magicians. Science had stripped off the surplusage, run it through the wringer of two-valued logic, and placed the knowledge in a form in which anyone could use it. Unfortunately, that part of magic which refused to conform to the neat categories of the 19th century methodologists was lopped off and left out of the body of science. It fell into disrepute, was forgotten save as fable and superstition. Waldo began to think of the arcane arts as aborted sciences. abandoned before they had been clarified. And yet the manifestations of the sort of uncertainty which had characterized some aspects of magic and which he now attributed to hypothetical additional continua had occurred frequently, even in modern times. The evidence was overwhelming to anyone who approached it with an open mind. Poltergeisten, stones falling from the sky, apportation, bewitched persons, or as he thought of them, persons who for some undetermined reason were loci of uncertainty, haunted houses, strange fires of that sort that would have once been attributed to salamanders. There were hundreds of such cases, carefully recorded and well vouched for, but ignored by orthodox science as being impossible. They were impossible by known law, but considered from the standpoint of a coextensive additional continuum, they became entirely credible. He cautioned himself not to consider his tentative hypothesis of the other world as proven. Nevertheless, it was an adequate hypothesis, even if it should develop that it did not apply to some of the cases of strange events. The other space might have different physical laws, no reason why it should not. Nevertheless, he decided to proceed on the assumption that it was much like the space he knew. The other world might even be inhabited. That was an intriguing thought. In which case, anything could happen through magic, anything. Time to stop speculating and get down to a little solid research. He had previously regretfully given up trying to apply the formulas of the medieval magicians. It appeared that they never wrote down all of a procedure, some essential, so the reports ran, and so his experience confirmed, was handed down verbally from master to student. His experience with Schneider confirmed this. There were things, attitudes, which must needs be taught directly. He regretfully set out to learn what he must unassisted. Gosh, Uncle Gus, I'm glad to see you. Decided I'd better look in on you. You haven't phoned me in weeks. That's true. I've been working awfully hard, Uncle Gus. Too hard, maybe. Mustn't overdo it. Let me see your tongue. I'm okay. But Waldo stuck out his tongue just the same. Grimes looked at it, felt his pulse. Seemed to be ticking all right. Learned anything? Quite a lot. I've about got the matter of the DeKalbs whipped. That's good. The message you sent Stevens seemed to indicate that you had found some hookup that could be used on my pet problem, too. In a way, yes, but around from the other end. It begins to see as if it was your problem which created Stevens' problem. Huh? I mean it. The symptoms caused by ultra-shortwave radiation may have a lot to do with the erratic behavior of the DeKalbs. How? I don't know myself, but I've rigged up a working hypothesis and I'm checking it. You want to talk about it? Certainly, to you. Waldo launched into an account of his interview with Schneider, concerning which he had not previously spoken to Grimes, even though Grimes had made the trip with him. He never, as Grimes knew, discussed anything until he was ready to. The story of the third set of DeKalbs to be infected with the incredible writhings caused Grimes to raise his eyebrows. Mean to say you caught on how to do that? Yes, indeed. Not how, maybe, but I can do it. I've done it more than once. I'll show you. He drifted away toward one side of the great room, where several sets of DeKalbs, large and small, were mounted, with their controls on temporary guise. This fellow over on the end, it just came in today. Broke down. I'll give it Gramps Schneider's hocus-pocus and fix it. Wait a minute. I forgot to turn on the power. He returned into the central ring, which constituted his usual locus, switched on the beamcaster. Since the ship itself effectively shielded anything in the room from outer radiation, he had installed a small power plant and caster similar in type to Nappa's giant ones. Without it, he would have no way to test the reception of the DeKalbs. He rejoined Grimes and passed down the line of DeKalbs, switched on the activizing circuits. All save two began to display the uncouth motions he had begun to think of as the Schneider flex. That one on the far end, he remarked, is in operation but doesn't flex. It has never broken down, so it's never been treated. It's my control. But this one, he touched the one in front of him, needs fixing. Watch me. What are you going to do? To tell the truth, I don't quite know, but I'll do it. He did not know. All he knew was that it was necessary to gaze down the antenna, think about them reaching into the other world, think of them reaching for power. Reaching. The antenna began to squirm. That's all there is to it, strictly between ourselves. I learned it from Schneider. They had returned to the center of the sphere at Grimes' suggestion, on the pretext of wanting to get a cigarette. The squirming decobs made him nervous, but he did not want to say so. How do you explain it? I regard it as an imperfectly understood phenomena of the other space. I know less about it than Franklin knew about lightning. But I will know. I will. I could give Stevens a solution right now for his worries if I knew some way to get around your problem, too. I don't see the connection. Well, there ought to be some way to do the whole thing through the other space. Start out by radiating power into the other space and pick it up from there. Then the radiation could not harm human beings, and it would never get at them. It would duck around them. I've been working on my caster, but with no luck so far. I'll crack it in time. I hope you do. Speaking of that, isn't the radiation from your own caster loose in this room? Yes. Then I'll put on my shield coat. It's not good for you either. Never mind, I'll turn it off. And as he turned to do so, there was the sound of a sweet, chirruping whistle. Balder barked. Grimes turned to see what caused it. What, he demanded, have you got there? Huh? Oh, that's my cuckoo clock. Fun, isn't it? Grimes agreed that it was, although he could not see much use for it. Waldo had mounted it on the edge of a light metal hoop, which spun with a speed just sufficient to produce a centrifugal force of 1 g. I rigged it up, Waldo continued, while I was bogged down in the problem of the other space. Gave me something to do. This other space business, I still don't get it. Think of another continuum much like our own and superposed on it the way you might lay one sheet of paper on another. The two spaces aren't identical, but they are separated from each other by the smallest interval that you can imagine. Coextensive but not touching, usually. There is an absolute one-to-one, point-for-point correspondence, as I can conceive it, between the two spaces. But they are not necessarily the same size or shape. Hey, come again? They would have to be. Not at all. Which has the larger number of points in it? A line an inch long, or a line a mile long? A mile long, of course. No, they have exactly the same number of points. You want me to prove it? I'll take your word for it, but I never studied that sort of math. All right. Take my word for it, then. Neither size nor shape is any impediment to setting up a full point-for-point correspondence between two spaces. Neither of the words is really appropriate. Size has to do with the space's own inner structure, its dimensions in terms of its own unique constants. Shape is a matter which happens inside itself, or at least not inside our space, and has to do with how it's curved, open, or closed, expanding or contracting. Grimes shrugged. It all sounds like gibberish to me. He returned to watching the cuckoo clock swing around and round its wheel. Sure it does, Waldo assented cheerfully. We are limited by our experience. Do you know how I think of the other world? The question was purely rhetorical. I think of it as about the size and shape of an ostrich egg, but nevertheless a whole universe existing side by side with our own. From here to the farthest star. I know that it's a false picture, but it helps me to think about it that way. I wouldn't know, said Grimes, and turned himself around in the air. The compound motion of the clock's pendulum was making him a little dizzy. Say, I thought you turned off the caster. I did, Waldo agreed, and looked where Grimes was looking. The decobs were still squirming. I thought I did, he said doubtfully, and turned to the caster's control board. His eyes then opened wider. But I did. It is turned off. Then what the devil? Shut up! He had to think. Think hard. Was the caster actually out of operation? He floated himself over to it, inspected it. Yes, it was dead as the dinosaurs. Just to make sure he went back, assumed his primary Waldos, cut in the necessary circuits, and partially disassembled it, but the decob still squirmed. The one decob, set which had not been subjected to the Schneider treatment, was dead. It gave no power hum. But the others were working frantically, gathering power from where? He wondered whether or not McLeod had said anything to Graham Schneider about the casters from which the decobs were intended to pick up their power. Certainly he himself had not. It simply had not come into the conversation, but Schneider had said something. The other world is close by and full of power. In spite of his own intention of taking the old man literally, he had ignored that statement. The other world is full of power. I'm sorry I snapped at you, Uncle Gus, he said. It's all right. But what do you make of that? Looks like you've invented perpetual motion, son. In a way, perhaps, or maybe we've repealed the law of conservation of energy. Those decobs are drawing energy that was never before in this world. To check his belief, he returned to the control ring, donned his Waldos, cut in a mobile scanner, and proceeded to search the space around the decobs with the most sensitive pickup for the radio power band he had available. The needles never jumped. The room was dead in the wavelengths to which the decobs were sensitive. The power came from outer space. The power came from outer space, not from his own beamcaster, not from Nappa's shiny stations, but from outer space. In that case, he was not even close to solving the problem of the defective decobs. He might never solve it. Wait now. Just what had he contracted to do? He tried to recall the exact words of the contract. There just might be a way around it, maybe. Yes, and this newest cockeyed trick of Gramps Schneider's little pets could have been some very tricky aspects. He began to see some possibilities, but he needed to think about it. Uncle Gus? Yes, Waldo? You can go back and tell Stevens that I'll be ready with the answers. We'll get his problem licked, and yours too. In the meantime, I've got to do some really heavy thinking, so I want to be by myself, please.